presented by 11M Cars. The beginning of a decade marked by tension, rebellion, and transformation. The American dream was being questioned, torn at the seams by war, civil unrest, and cultural revolution. But in the heart of Detroit, amidst strikes, layoffs, and an uncertain future, Chevrolet quietly unleashed something bold, something violent, something beautiful. It was the 1970 Malibu SS 454, and to understand why this car mattered, why it still turns heads 5 decades later, you have to understand what America looked like in that moment. In May of 1970, 4 college students were gunned down by the Ohio National Guard at Kent State University. The protest against the Vietnam War spiraled into tragedy, and the images of young Americans lying dead on campus lawns were broadcast across the country. The nation was deeply divided. Faith in government was crumbling. Trust in leadership failing. The war in Vietnam raged on. Over 350,000 troops were still deployed. The draft continued, and while some enlisted with pride, others burned their draft cards in the streets. Meanwhile, at home, the civil rights movement had evolved into the Black Power era. The voices were louder, the demands sharper. The murder of Fred Hampton by Chicago police in late 1969 was still fresh in people's minds. The streets were boiling over with tension. Riots broke out in cities across the country. America was restless, aggressive, desperate for identity. And yet, the culture never stopped moving. In 1970, Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin died just weeks apart, both at the age of 27. Their deaths marked the end of the psychedelic era, the last gasp of Woodstock optimism. The Beatles officially disbanded. Simon and Garfunkel released Bridge Over Troubled Water. Black Sabbath dropped their debut album, planting the seeds of heavy metal. The sound of rebellion was changing. On the big screen, Patton won Best Picture, but 5 Easy Pieces, starring Jack Nicholson, and MASH showed that Hollywood was ready to explore darker, more complex characters. Anti-heroes were in. The mood had shifted. Dino Botcher, Brian Alps. In sports, a young boxer named Muhammad Ali was fighting his way back into the ring after being stripped of his title for refusing the draft. He became a symbol, not just of athleticism, but of defiance. America was falling in love with rebels. And that's where the 1970 Malibu SS 454 comes in. Because this wasn't a car for the conformist. It wasn't for your average commuter, your suburban dad, or the aging baby boomer who still clung to the Eisenhower years. No, this Malibu was for the gearhead, the speed junkie, the outlaw on the highway. Let's break it down. The 1970 Malibu SS 454 wasn't technically a separate model. It was part of the Chevelle lineup, Chevy's mid-size bread and butter coupe. But if you optioned it just right, check the right boxes, you got something ferocious. At the heart of it was the LS6 454 cubic inch V8. Rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, it was the most powerful engine General Motors had ever installed in a production car. 0 to 60 in 5.4 seconds, quarter mile in the low 13s, on street tires in 1970. It was a street-legal drag racer. It didn't whisper, it didn't purr, it growled, it snarled, it threw its weight around. And even though it wore the Malibu badge, a name associated with base model coupes and mild-mannered sedans, this car was anything but mild. Outside, the body was long and lean. The Coke bottle shape was perfectly sculpted, with that unmistakable rise in the rear fender, giving it an aggressive, muscular stance. Dual headlights, a split front grille, optional racing stripes running from hood to trunk. It looked like it belonged on a NASCAR track, and in some cases it did. If you ordered the SS 454 with the Z15 option, you got more than just engine upgrades. You got a cowl induction hood that opened under throttle, feeding cold air directly into the beast. You got F41 suspension, power front disc brakes, and a heavy-duty rear axle that could take a beating. You got sway bars, better shocks, and that all-important SS badging. Inside, bucket seats, full instrumentation, a horseshoe shifter, and if you knew what you were doing, you could get it with a 4-speed Muncie manual, making it one of the most satisfying American muscle cars ever built to row through. But here's what made the 1970 Malibu SS 454 so special. stealth. While Pontiac GTOs and Dodge Chargers were loud, flashy, and practically begged for attention, the Malibu SS 454 could hide in plain sight. It could be optioned without stripes, without spoilers, and without visual hints of what it was packing under the hood. To the untrained eye, it was just another Malibu. But the moment the light turned green, the truth came out. This wasn't just muscle. This was muscle dressed like a gentleman. The timing of this car's release couldn't have been better, or worse, because 1970 marked the high-water mark of the muscle car era. The performance wars between Ford, Mopar, and GM had reached a fever pitch. Horsepower numbers were soaring. 400, 425, even 450 horsepower became realistic, street-legal numbers. But it was also the beginning of the end. Insurance companies, terrified by the rising number of fatalities and claims involving high-performance cars, began slamming owners with massive premiums. Emissions regulations were looming. The EPA was created that same year, December 2nd, 1970. The Clean Air Act would soon force automakers to rethink engine design. 1970 was the last year automakers could go absolutely insane with performance. And they did. The Malibu SS 454 was a result of that insanity. And it was beautiful. Only a few thousand were ever built. Most people associate the LS6 454 with the Chevelle SS. But there were Malibus, real Malibus, that carried this beastly powertrain under their hoods. That rarity makes them even more collectible today. In the years that followed, GM would begin detuning its engines. Compression ratios dropped. Horsepower ratings fell. By 1972, the party was over. The big blocks were choking, the styling softened, the danger was gone. But in 1970, the Malibu SS 454 represented everything America loved about cars: freedom, danger, rebellion, and power. You could take this car to the strip on Friday night, run a 13-second quarter mile, and on Monday you could drop your kid off at school in it. That was the beauty. It wasn't just a car, it was a statement. And in an era where the country was trying to find itself, where young people were rejecting authority, where music was evolving, where lines were being redrawn every day, the Malibu SS 454 fit the moment perfectly. It was fast, it was raw, it was real. It wasn't a compromise. It didn't care about your insurance premiums, your emissions ratings, or your gas mileage. It wasn't trying to make friends, it was trying to win. 50 years later, the legend lives on. Collectors who find original LS6-equipped Malibus know what they have. They're not just holding on to a piece of metal, they're preserving a piece of American history, a time capsule from a moment when Detroit ruled the road and horsepower was the ultimate flex. Today's Malibu is a front-wheel drive family car, safe, efficient, predictable. But in 1970, the Malibu had fangs, and if you were lucky enough to get your hands on one with the 454, you weren't just driving a Malibu, you were driving one of the baddest, boldest, and most beautifully brutal cars ever built. And if you pulled up next to one back then, and you didn't know what it was already too late.